Hey, what's up everyone? Mekkah here, back with another Fire Emblem archetype tier list. Today we are tackling the long requested Ogmas, the Mercenary Boys. I think these guys are the epitome of basis overgrowths because they almost always join ready to fight, ready to kick some butt. They've got a good combination of like pretty much every good stat. They've got good bulk with HP and strength, or like HP and defense, but they also got like good strength and speed as well. So generally they're very easy to use and very easy to promote and keep going all the way through. And that makes them pretty popular. A lot of people really like their Ogmas. So what I've got here, I've got Ogma from FE3 and FE1, as well as Shadow Dragon and FE12. I've got Saber and Kamui from Gaiden and Shadows of Valencia. I've got Holland from FE4, Fergus from FE5, Deke from FE6, Raven from FE7, Garrick from FE8, Gregor from Awakening, and I've got Shuda from The Last Promise. Bit of a surprise here. You can see there isn't that many characters here. I was compiling Mercenaries for this tier list, and I honestly found that some games like Path of Radiance or Radiant Dawn just didn't really have appropriate characters that I wanted to put on here. In fact, some of these themselves could be considered like a bit of a stretch. Because, for example, I could put like Ike here from Radiant Dawn or Path of Radiance because he's part of the Grill Mercenaries. He's a swordsman for hire. He's a big bulky guy. Some of these even have like implied platonic relationships with girls that Ike also has. But I wanted to save Ike for the Lord tier list that I'm eventually going to be doing, so I'm going to leave him off for now. That leaves Telias without a representative. Fergus, for example, is a bit of a stretch. He does say he's a mercenary. I decided I wanted characters that are on some kind of payroll, like they're not just a mercenary in class, but also a bit in the story. So that makes people like Ogma and Saber pretty logical, I think. I think Saber gets bribed by Celica in Shadows of Valencia. So Ogma is hired by the Talis royalty. Holin is kind of different because he's a gladiator, but you still got to beat the arena to get him. So that kind of gives him a relationship to gold in some way. I think he's a better fit than Beowulf at any rate, and I definitely want to do like a tier list at some point of like characters that join through gold, people that you literally got to bribe to get in, like Beowulf and like Folk, people like that. So I got Fergus here because he says he's a mercenary, and FE5 doesn't really have any better representatives. I considered Ralph instead because he also says he's a mercenary, but his join time and like the fact that he joins promoted makes him so different from the rest of these that I decided Fergus would be a better fit for here. And he doesn't have like the prerequisite good basis that these other characters all boast. I think no one will really contest Deke. Raven is almost more like a Navarre than an Ogma, considering the way he joins. You gotta talk to him while he's an enemy. Pretty much none of these start as enemies unless you count Holland as like a gladiator. Garrick is hired by Inez, so he counts, I guess. Gregor, I don't think he's ever really hired by Crom properly, but I think he mentioned being mercenary at some point. And Shuda is definitely hired in Last Promise, from what I remember. So that's the logic I went with. If your favorite character is not on here, don't worry, they'll be used in the future. But for now, let's just rank these guys. So I said these are rarely ever the best because of their lack of amount, and sometimes they're kind of lacking weapon versatility, but I will say these are generally very good characters. There's no bad characters in here from what I can tell, because almost all these have the availability and the stats to just kick enemy ass. And the question of these is, of course, which of them does it the most efficiently, which one of them does it the best. So we'll start with the Ogmas. I don't know why I put them out of order like this. I kind of want them all together here. So I'll be honest, I've been like misrating a couple of characters from FE3 in particular that I haven't really done a very good job of rating, but the problem is I haven't finished FE3 still as we speak, and I think FE3 Book 1 in particular was kind of boring. I have finished FE3 Book 2 a couple times though. So Ogma is in FE1, he's a mercenary there just like Navarre, and honestly all incarnations of Ogma are like viable to some extent, of course. I think Ogma in FE1 is one of the better characters overall, but I'm not sure exactly where I would place him. I do think FE3 Book 1 and Book 2 Ogma are both decent, but not like super great. I will put them around here probably, maybe even down here. FE3 of course has forced dismounting. It's only a couple of maps, but I do think it matters a bit in those maps. And in those maps, Ogma has more movement than, for example, your cavalry. He has like the same movement as Marth as a hero, which is pretty good. I think it's even more than that. Let me just double check. Yeah, so Ogma has the same movement as Marth, basically, no matter what. Marth has 7 move, Ogma, both as a mercenary and a hero, has 7 move, so you can keep up with him, and the cavalry would fall behind. But for example, in Shadow Dragon and New Mystery, he wouldn't have the movement of a Cavalier, but in those games he can reclass anyway. and you can still make use of his high sword rank if you reclass him to Cavalier, so he's still pretty decent in those games. But what I like about FE3 Ogma is basically just solid bases, and the enemies aren't very good, so we can probably one round pretty much all of them. Maybe like not Draco Knights, unless you give him the Worm Slayer, but in general I don't think there's like any enemy type that Ogma particularly struggles with. He has his limitations, but these limitations are shared by almost everyone else in the cast, so I think this is a reasonable fit for him. I have used him in, I think, my FE3 Book 2 playthrough before, but it's a long time ago. FE11 Ogma, so he has a pretty good start. He looks pretty strong at first when you don't have a battle prep screen. I think even in Hard 5 he's got a shot at doubling pirates as long as he's using an iron sword, and he stays like that for like a couple chapters. But then after the early game the axes just sort of vanish, and instead you face mostly enemy lances, which really hurts characters like Ogma, who really rely on their sword rank, because you can reclass Ogma into other classes, but he doesn't have that many options for him. You cannot become a Cavalier in Shadow Dragon. That class line is locked to the other set of males. He can become something like a Hunter or a Dark Mage or a Fighter. But the problem with going to those is that his rank is going to be bad. The only way he retains his high sword rank is, while he's promoted at least, it's going to be, staying as a mercenary. And as a mercenary, he's going to face constant weapon trial disadvantage against Shadow Dragon enemies, because lances are by far the most common enemy type. It does give him a niche in being able to use the Armor Slayer, for example. The Killing Edge can be a pretty good weapon to give him, although Killing Edges are kind of nerfed in those games. There's another effective weapon that I'm forgetting for a moment. Oh yeah, Worm Slayers, you can use those too. Those are kind of nice, but not as nice as they are in FE12, for example. And Ogma is like, he doesn't have anything over, for example, Barst, who has a higher axe rank, and axes are much more useful. And me and Mangs were doing a Shadow Dragon Let's Play long ago, and he rated Ogma like 4 stars or something, and Barst like 2 or 3 stars. I was like, are you crazy? Barst is like an infinitely better version of Ogma, because Barst has a better weapon type. He mains axes, which are much more useful in a game dominated by enemy lances, and he just has higher base stats. If you reclass him into the same class, Ogma would have worse stats all around. The only good thing for Ogma is being a mercenary for a little bit, but pretty much everything he does well is just because the things that any mercenary could do, like any generic mercenary with a high sword rank could do. And there's not many uses for a character with a high sword rank in Shadow Dragon overall. There are some, but they are far and far between in my opinion. So that's why the original Ogma in Shadow Dragon is, in my opinion, actually one of the worst units on this list. Kind of strange when you think about it. Next we have FE12 Ogma. Now this one I like a lot better. He still joins relatively early in chapter 4, and he's actually pretty crucial there for defending, well, he's helping with Siriu to defend Ubello and Yumina, but even after that he stays pretty good. He has like a chance of death if you expose him to all the pirates that he's in with his joining situation, depends on difficulty, but usually he does a pretty good job of taking care of them, especially in the original, which is why I like this version of Ogma so much. Like Lunatic of FE12, he'll probably get his butt kicked, but he's pretty alright. He can reclass much better in FE12, just like any male unit. He can become a Wyvern Rider if you wanted him to be, or like a Cavalier or a Paladin, because in FE12, once you beat the game once, you unlock all different class lines. Now, more reclass options for FE12 Ogma is great for him compared to FE12, because for example, he can go Cavalier, he can go Paladin and retain his sword rank, and maybe build up something else, although it would take a while for him to pick up anything but swords. But in FE12, you also have more uses for swords, because the enemy types is not just lances. You have more axe enemies to face, for instance, and weapon triangle matters quite a bit in both FE12 and FE11, so that's why I'm putting such an emphasis on it. So I think this Ogma is definitely like at least a tier better than the previous one. I think this one can definitely belong here, for example. I don't think he's as good as the good old Ogma. I think there are units that can do pretty much everything you want out of an FE12 unit better, but I think he belongs up here somewhere. I could see moving them down a little bit, like maybe put him at the bottom of a C and him at the higher end of C maybe. But this is how I would put it. He's not bad. He can definitely put work in. FE12 is pretty generous with its units. You can use almost anyone and they're almost all viable in some way or another. He's not as great as like Sirius or Pala or Chris, but he's pretty good. Next one we have is Saber and Kamui from FE2 and Shadows of Valencia. Oh boy, these guys are really good, and this is because this game works very differently from others in a lot of aspects. The first one is just that the Dreadfighter class, which they eventually promote into, is just so insanely good in that game. It's one of the few classes that can stand up to magic. They depending on like which version of the guidance story you're playing. They just kind of negate magical attacks almost completely thanks to their high resistance, and I think in Shadows of Valencia it's like called a transmute skill or something, where they just don't, they like have any magic damage or something. It's like pretty insane. It has more mobility than almost all the other foot unit classes. Cavalry in general and like is a lot worse in those games. And then you do have like flyers on your team like Pala and Katria and Est, I guess, who do have a little bit more mobility, but other than that they are like the top of everyone when it comes to moving around. They are much more mobile than anyone else, and that combined with their ability to resist magic is just invaluable. There are some good swords available for both of them to use, and not that much competition for who gets to use them. They're pretty good candidates for them, and I think these two are very similar. A lot of people feel like Saber is like really good, and Kamui people are more divided on. Like, oh, I can't really find anyone who thinks Saber is bad, but a lot of people rate Kamui a lot lower. But I think they're really similar. I think the main difference between them that just depends on what weapon you give them. If you give Saber a better weapon than Kamui, he's going to be better. But if you swap them around, then probably Kamui is better, because they are so similar. This is especially due to the way that FE2 and Shadows of Valencia handles promotional bonuses. So in those games, whenever you promote to whichever one, you promote to the class bases of the new class that you turn into. So for example, let's say you have 5 speed, and you promote to a class that has 8 base speed. You gain 3 points of speed. If you had 6 speed instead, you only gain 2 points. So there's not much point in training up your speed before promoting, because you're going to be put up to 8 no matter what you do. Of course, if you are higher than 8 before promoting, then you just don't gain any points. You also don't get lowered. But the point here is, first of all, promote as early as possible. This is always a good idea, or almost always a good idea. But it's especially great for Gaiden and Shadows of Valencia characters. But also it means that like any stat deficiencies that Kamui has compared to the class he promotes into, they just get erased. So they'll be very similar every time they promote. And I think they start as like Mercenaries, and then become, and like Myrmidons, and then like Heroes, and then Dreadfighter. I think that's sort of the way they go. And pretty much the whole part 2 of Celica's route is basically just trying to get them to promotion, I feel like, along with your archers, because those are really good as well. Those are some very important promotion targets. So I think I'm comfortable putting both of these up in S tier. Honestly, now if I made like a tier list of like all the characters of Fire Emblem, I wouldn't put these like very high into S tier. I would put people like Camilla, like Har, like Corrin, Brioma. I would put those over those two for sure, because they break the game a lot harder than these two do. But I think in the context of this tier list, I don't feel comfortable putting them in the same tier list, or the same tier as FE3 Ogma. I think they're definitely a cut better. If anything, I would rather put Ogma further down than put these further down in A tier, than to change anything else here. But I'm pretty comfortable that Saber at least deserves to be S tier. And I think as long as Saber is somewhere, I think Kamui should be in the same tier. They're not that different. And this game is like a very good argument against class by class, because honestly, there's no reason to use one over the other. You should always use both, especially considering how in Celica's games, or in Celica's parts, it's not like you're forced to undeploy anyone, and it's not like you have like limited promotion items or something, so there's no reason to only use one of each class, no matter what. You're so limited in options anyway, you might as well just use both. Next up we have Holden in FE4, and I'm afraid this is going to be one of the lower ratings again, because Holden is an unmounted unit in FE4. Now so far, the units I've been rating have not been very impacted by other like competition of like better units. Somehow movement isn't a big issue. For example, for these two, they tend to have the higher mobility out of all the units there, and there's infinite range warp staffs to get them around further if you want to. At least in the case of FE2, where you can put Silk on Celica's route by killing her off and then reviving her. Ogma again is in her game with an infinite range warp staff, so you can move him around if you want him to, and then he's also like in some cases not even like left behind by cavalry in the case of indoor maps in FE3. So there's a lot of mitigating factors. Ogma in general, heroes in general, just have good mobility in those games. But Holden, compared to everyone else, is one of the few unmounted units, and that really sucks in FE4. Like, you recruit Holden in Chapter 2 by beating him in the arena, and then he'll join you. And right away it will become clear just how little things, like how little fighting Holden gets to do, unless you go out of your way to slow down for him. But the thing about Chapter 2 is you can't really slow down, because you gotta hurry up. First off, you gotta hurry up to rescue Lachesis from the attack from Elliot, and then you gotta go and seize Herrheim so you can make sure to get the bargain ring from the village before it burns down. So staying behind for Holden isn't really an option if you want to get all the possible rewards. And FE4 kind of continues the trend where it just keeps setting villages on fire and give you honor incentives, just, you know, hurry up and play through the chapter fast. And Holland can't keep up with that because the guy has 6 move, whereas your cavalry has 8 move, or even 9 move in the case of Sigurd and Quan. And then to make it even worse, like, almost the entire chapter consists of like road tiles you can move over, like the route between both castles that you start in and you gotta seize. It's like all road tiles, so that movement advantage gets exacerbated. Is that how I pronounce it? I always fuck up at least one word every tier list video, no matter what. But yeah, that means that, for example, they might have like 12 move, whereas Holland only has like 8 move, so the gap becomes even further. And then it's not just over the course of one turn, but for example, the first few turns of chapter 2, they move across like road tiles for like 3 or 4 turns straight before they're at the enemy. And that means that Holland falls that many turns behind on top of the movement at disadvantage he already had. So that 4 tiles he was behind is now being multiplied to like 12 tiles behind or something, which is a huge gap to make up for. And he also doesn't have Canto, so whenever he attacks an enemy, he can't move further ahead towards the objective or backwards to get into a safer position. So basically the point I'm making is not being a multi-unit in FE4 is a really big deal. And that means that no matter what your combat is, you're already at a huge disadvantage when compared to other units. And that really sucks for Holland. It also affects other units in FE4, it affects Jamka, it affects Ira. It really just affects just about everyone who's not on a mount. And it sucks, but I don't make the rules. It makes Holland a lot worse. His combat is not bad. He can clear the arena, he has the Luna skill, and he has a pretty good basis, like all these units, to the point where if you give him like a Steel Blade or something, he can probably two-shot a lot of like the frailer enemy types. For example, if you were to put him up against, for example, Beowulf's Free Knight squad, like that squad that also has the boss with the Paragon Ring, I think his name is like Volts, I forgot what his name is in the translation patch, but you know, those short knights, I think he one-rounds them at base level, which is very impressive. So I don't have anything to complain about with regards to his combat. If he doesn't 2-hit KO, he has to rely on Luna to do so, which is kind of annoying, but that rarely happens. Even if he has to go up against, say, armored units, he has the option to use either the Armor Slayer for effective damage, which will probably let him 2-shot, or the Hero Sword. It's going to attack so many times that even if it doesn't kill the enemy, you'll probably get a Luna at least once. And that will just get the job done with. I'm actually not sure if Luna can proc on every hit separately in this game, but he will probably kill the enemy. The problem is, of course, there's only one Brave Sword in Gen 1, so he might not be able to get it. But anyway, even though Holden looks like a lot like Ogma here, I'm actually going to put him around here. I think he's one of the worst units on this list. Not because he's incompetent, not because it's impossible to raise him, but because compared to these units, his flaw of less movement really hurts him a lot more than these other units. Now, next up we have one of my favorites, Fergus from Fire Emblem 5, Thracia 776. Of course, that's one of my favorites. I like him a lot, I'm going to say that. I'm going to try to be not biased too much, but I really love him as a unit. So, Fergus joins in Chapter 4 in the Master Chapter, and initially he doesn't have any weapons, but once you get some swords from the chests, or you trade them some because Machua and Brighton come with extras, he can get a weapon and he can fight. The best weapon that he can use by far early on is the Rapier, which is found in one of the chests in Chapter 4. No matter which weapons you take into Master, the Rapier will always be there. Unless you override it by bringing like every single item ever, like filling all of the slots on Leaf and Lithus. And when he has the Rapier, he gains 10 crit and effectiveness against armors. Now that's not great enough itself, but Fergus also has a 5% critical rate, which means that whenever Fergus double attacks, his second hit has 5 times as much critical as it normally would have. So let's do the math, for example. Let's say Fergus has about like, I think he has 7 base skill, so that alone is like 35 crit on the second hit, which is like already killing edge levels of competence, right? In other games. Then add like the 10th crit from Rapier, he already has like 85 crit at base level without anything. Now in Chapter 4 there's also another character that joins called Karen, and Karen gives Fergus 10 crit. He also gives her 10 crit, but on Fergus is much more useful because that crit also gets multiplied. So Fergus on the second hit would actually have a 100% chance to crit at base level, which is stupid. But Fergus with the Rapier and Karen in range is a guaranteed crit at base level, and that makes him very good against enemy armor knights. And there's a couple of those in his joining chapter, there's a couple of those in the next chapter as well, and he's just really good for it. Now, not only does he have C-rank swords at base to use the Rapier, and he's the only character to do so besides, like, I think Leaf might have C-swords at that point too, but Leaf isn't nearly as good as using the Rapier as Fergus is, because he doesn't have as high of a crit rate. So then Fergus is like about 10 or 20 swings away from being able to use B swords. Because in FE5 you don't just join with like say C or D, but like C plus 30 for example, which is 30 weapon XP into the next rank. Kind of like, this can happen in Shadow Dragon too, but I don't think a lot of other games have it like that. So that means Fergus is able to use B swords pretty soon, which means he can use the Brave sword that you can find in chapter 4X, which is useful for just hitting enemies before they can counter you. Once he becomes like pretty fast, he can quadruple people with it, but it's also nice to just avoid counterattacks or to captures. Because he has the build to capture mages, for example. And then he can also use, I think, the Armor Slayer's B rank as well, but that one's not as useful, I think. The big one is the Fire Sword, which you can use to gain 1 to range and +5 magic, so he becomes good at 1 to range. And that +5 magic also adds resistance to mages, because magic in FE5 functions as both magical attack power and resistance, basically. It's combined into one stat. So it becomes more bulky against mages, and he's one of the best ways to counter mages on enemy phase if you need someone to do that. He'll probably kill them because +5 magic is a lot. The sword is pretty high in might. His base magic is trash, but combined with, say, the crit rate from Karen, it's pretty reliable way to kill mages if you need him to. So Fergus is very versatile. His main weakness in Manster indoors is, well, he's supposed to be mounted, but you're forced to dismount in FE5, so only has 5 move for a while. I got lucky on my Iron Man currently. He has 6 move right now, but he usually has 5 move. And that sucks a little bit because, for example, Leaf and Aspel are more mobile than him, but most other units are stuck with 5 move as well. So he's not going to fall very far behind unless you're trying to like LTC the game, which I know not a lot of people do. Like, it annoyed Don a lot when he's playing 0% growth that Fergus only had 5 move, and that's why I rated him lower than, say, Aspel and Leaf. But generally, I think Fergus's move is fine for Manster. And once you go outdoors, he has more move than anyone else. I think he goes up to 8 before he's promoted. He gets a mount in chapter 6 from the top of my head, and from that point on, he's just one of your better units for a little bit. The fact that he can move ahead of the pack and kill enemies and then retreat if needed to get healed. Vulneraries are very nice in FE5, they just heal you completely, so Fergus can like take care of himself if he needs to. I'm kind of drifting off topic here, but the point is Fergus is very good. Now, anytime you go back indoors in FE5, Fergus is kind of not great. He's better than most mod units because he keeps his sword rank. Mod units like Finn, who normally use lances but are forced to go to swords when going indoors, they're not as good indoors. The same goes for Axe Knights like Brighton and Hicks. But Fergus keeps his sword rank, so he can be viable indoors. I usually don't deploy him indoors. I think there's better units, like I usually pick like Shiva, for example, because he has 1 more move. But Fergus can be good indoors if you need him to be. Fergus, for me, stays useful for pretty much the whole game. Not a lot of Thracia is like not very combat based, so at some point Fergus becomes like a face in the crowd where you don't really need that much combat to be done in FE5. But he's one of the characters that I like to give scrolls to because he just has such a good enemy phase. So if you give him a couple scrolls, he'll take advantage of them, get like a couple levels in the course of like 1 enemy phase. That kind of happens sometimes, especially early game in Master. And Master's like the most combat heavy portion of the game. So if there's a time for a combat unit to be good, it's definitely then. So for that reason, I'm going to put Fergus like pretty high up, like in 8th here. I know this is a little bit controversial. I don't think everyone would put him there. As I said, I'm a little bit biased towards Fergus. I could see him going down to like maybe B tier or something. It depends. Thracia roles and characters are a little bit weird. But I think he deserves to be up here. I think he's definitely one of the best combat units in the game. Like, Orson might be better strictly at combat because he has the Pooji, so he's like more reliable 1 to range. But other than that, I can't think of a whole lot of units that are like better all around than Fergus. I think Asel has like better competence at like straight up offense and killing bosses, for example. I think Aspel is definitely better than that. But Aspel also has like less durability than Fergus. If you don't pump him full of stat boosters, that boosts his HP like I usually do. So I think that is something that should be taken into account. I think Fergus is one of the best combat units in FE5, mostly due to the Pursuit Critical and the high sword rank. Next up on the list is Deke from FE6. Now this is one guy that I'm definitely sure is based on Ogma. Just because of the way he joins. He joins along with 2 fighters, like Ogma joins with 3 fighters. And he's kind of like connected to a Pegasus Knight, so Deke has Shanna for that, and then the original Ogma is like has a connection to Sheeta a little bit. So that's the reason why I think he's basically a copy of Ogma, and that's why I'm sure he should be on this list. Like, a lot of these others are a little bit different, but Ogma, like a lot of FE6's early cast, is like a copy of Marth's army and their equivalents. So Deke is very good in his joining chapter, and that gives him a really good first impression that makes a lot of people just stick to him. He joins a little higher level than most of your other units. He's like level 5, whereas most of your other units are like level 2, level 3 maybe, depending on how much XP you gave them. And his bases reflect that. He has pretty good base strength and speed. Like I said, a lot of these units, they have a good balance of bulk and strength and speed, and early game Deke definitely reflects that. He has enough attack power to 2-hit KO most enemy fighters, and I do believe he can actually one-round them on hard mode at base level with an Iron Blade, which is very impressive. Not a lot of characters in FE6 are that good at base level. In fact, very few of them are. It's like Milady and Percival maybe, but even Milady struggles to double before she promotes. For a little bit at least, against like enemies that aren't just weighed down. Rutger doubles, I guess, but he doesn't 2-hit KO anything. So Deke looks very good at first, especially if you're playing normal mode. Then he looks even better because the enemies are weaker, but Ogma is still, or not Ogma, Deke is still equally good. So yeah, a lot of people really like Deke, and I can't blame them for it. I will say, I think Deke is a lot weaker in the long term than a lot of people give him credit for. Normal mode, I think he does just fine. But what I dislike about Deke in the long term is his speed isn't that good. His growth is only like 30%. So while his base is great, and I'm always a fan of bases over growths, I think at some point he becomes unable to double reliably. It depends on the enemy type. A lot of heavy 6 enemies are weighed down still by like javelins, steel lances, or other random heavy weapons. Hand axes are pretty heavy too. But I've seen Deke fail to double quite a few things, and not just personal experience, he does that quite a bit. So in the long term, I think Deke has some doubling issues. There's also some accuracy issues I find, because FE6 weapons just aren't that accurate, so whenever you have him use blades against something that isn't like a slow pirate or something, like an enemy weighed down by their axe, giving like weapon triangle advantage to Deke, I find he struggles to hit with blades a lot of the time, and they're not the most reliable option. Part of this is personal experience, but for example, I remember Mangs made a spotlight on Deke a while ago, and he was really praising Deke at first. I think he gave him like 4 stars or something, not 5, but like 4 stars for utility, and I raised these points to him, and he went back to try him out on hard mode. He's like, yeah, you know what, you're right. So Mangs is a big Deke's fan, big Deke fan, and he noticed the same thing. So no, I'm not alone on this. And I know like a lot of efficiency players, for example, they tend to like put Deke by the wayside too. I think Deke is best used to take advantage of his early game utility, but I don't think he's really worth promoting unless you really like him or you're playing like normal mode. Another big problem I have with Deke sometimes is he's very heavy. He has like a lot of con, which is great when you don't want to use blades and don't get weighed down. But it also has a flip side where he becomes harder to rescue. Again, not as big of an issue in the early game, because at that point he hasn't had a con increase yet, so he's still like rescuable by, for example, unpromoted Cavaliers. But when your Cavaliers promotes, they gain Constitution. As a result, they lose 8, because the 8 formula subtracts your con from a base 25 for males and 20 for females. So, for example, if a Cavalier has 10 Constitution, that gets subtracted from their 25 base aid, so they're left with 15 aid, which means they can rescue Deke just fine. When they promote, they gain like 2 con, so they lose 2 8, and as a result, they tend to be unable to rescue Deke. And FE6 maps are very huge, and I find that foot units have a hard time keeping up with mounted units. You have a lot of good mounted units in that game, between like Alan, Lance, Marcus, and Zealot, depending on what point in the game you're at. Percival, Milady, Shanna can be pretty good if you use her right. I think I mentioned Percival. The point is there's a lot of good flyers in that game, and also Zeus is there, I guess. But either way, when you can't keep up as a foot unit, you kind of get the same problem as in FE4, but to a lesser extent. And not being able to be rescued is a big problem for people like Deke, and I think Gonzalez is a problem as well. So people like Rutger, for example, they're better off because they're lighter, so just about anyone can pick them up. I'm pretty sure Rutger can be picked up by even by people with like Milady, who has pretty low aid, because females have less aid to begin with, and Milady has pretty high con. So I think that makes it a bit harder for Deke to keep up with the main group. Now, if you're playing a little bit slowly, then I think the game becomes a lot more tedious in FE6. I think the maps are definitely built for rescue dropping for a little bit, because it has like a lot of empty stretches for a little bit. And I think that makes Deke a bit worse for sure. Now, I'm sounding like I hate him. I don't hate him. I'm just going to put him up pretty high still. I think he's like, B tier still. I'm just explaining why I'm not putting him up very high. Because I think he's a reliable unit, especially if you're just playing normal mode. But on hard mode, I think he takes a bit of a hit, and I think he has some doubling issues. He can still double quite a few enemies, especially once you promote him. A nice thing for heroes that a lot of people bring up for the GBA games is that they gain axes. I don't think this does a whole lot for Deke, because in that game, hand axes are trash when it comes to their accuracy. I like to give him one like every once in a while, just to have the option to counter things when he has nothing else to do in enemy phase otherwise. But you can never rely on them hitting, because hand axes are just so trash in that game. Iron axes can be nice, but I think that's like the only thing he can use. I think he has like D axes, if not E rank axes after promotion, which is horrible. It doesn't really, like, generally he wants to use high attack weapons, like killing edges, for example. You can buy those in chapter 13. So you don't really want to use axes very much. If you can get into killer axes, that could be good, I guess. Killer axes are basically like better versions of iron axes, but that takes quite a bit of training. Raising weapon ranks in FE6 is kind of a pain in the ass, because every single weapon type gives 1 point of weapon XP. So that can be a bit annoying. But I like Deke, but not as much as some of these others. Raven is one I like very much. another story about Mangs and Mekkah arguing about unit ratings, because these are always fun to bring up. So first FE7 playthrough, first playthrough that Mangs and I ever did together was on his channel. We came to Raven, we were going to rate him. I think he gave Raven like 3 stars. I don't think he went as low as 2 stars, but I think he went like 3 stars, saying he was a bit underleveled, I think, like not very impressed, low luck or something. I think those were his complaints. But Raven has pretty much one of the best base offenses in all of FE7. It's very impressive to see. FE7 is an easy game, but there's not many people in that game that have both good strength and good speed. Like, which units in FE7 can one-round enemies at that point in the game? All I can think of is Marcus. Oswin is strong, but he doesn't double one. I don't think he one-rounds much in heart-to-heart mode. He does in normal mode, but not in heart-to-heart mode. Guy, he's pretty fast, but unless he's using the killing edge, he's probably not killing whatever you're facing. I'm having trouble thinking of anyone else. Like, Lowen and Kent and Sane are good units, but they don't kill everything in one round at that point in the game. Hector, he can one-hit KO Cavaliers sometimes, but even that is like borderline. And those are the enemy types he's best against. Like, he can one-round Armor Knights, I guess. People like Dorcas and Bartra and Lynn, they're not one-rounding anything. Urk is not one-rounding anything. So Raven, straight up at base level, like there's like an archer that starts near him, you can one-round him with the weapon he comes with, the steel sword. And he keeps doing that to archers and pirates throughout like all of the mid game. It's stupidly strong, and his growths aren't bad either. I think Raven really shows that the level stat in Fire Emblem should not be used as to like judge how good a unit is, not without looking at their stats in context, because it really just determines how much XP you get and whether you can promote or not, and that's basically it. And usually they give units appropriate base stats for their level, but with Raven they kind of fucked that up because he's only level 5, but his strength and speed are by far the best combination of them that you've seen like all the early game. At some point you get like pre-promotes that are like better than Raven, but even then he can compare favorably to them with just promotion. Raven definitely takes advantage of getting access to promotion, because if there's one weakness he has, is that he's locked his swords. And FE7 is a pretty bad game to be locked his swords into. Like, I complain about this whenever I talk about Guy or Lynn or Eliawood, and Raven deserves all the same criticism before promotion, because the lack of being able to counter mages and javelins and hand axes is super annoying. But thankfully he makes up for it, because he promotes into a hero and he gets hand axes at, like whenever he promotes, and it's just kind of a dilemma. Do you promote him early to get like good 1-2 range, or do you keep him unpromoted for longer and then you get to take advantage of his accelerated XP gain, because he gets all the good benefits of being low level by getting fast XP gain on his top of his like good growth. I think he has like he has 40 plus in both strength and speed, for example, so his level ups are generally pretty okay. And once he's promoted, once he has hand axes, he still has some of the best offense on your team for a pretty long while. Like, even Don used Raven in his 0% growth run for quite a while on FE7, just because of how good his offense is. So he doesn't really fall off because his growths are so good. If there's one weakness he has, is like he has like low resistance, and I guess his speed cap is like 25, which can be a problem against Valkyries in Conquer Destiny, because those can have like 20 speed, 21 speed. And if Raven weighs himself down with a hand axe, he doesn't have the con to use hand axes. He can't double them. He doubles like everything else though. So there's often this argument between like Raven and Harken, which is better. People will argue that Harken is better because he's better at using axes. Harken will probably have a better axe rank if you don't train Raven's axe rank, but Raven will always be faster than Harken when using axes, always. Because Raven just has higher speed, and Harken might have higher constitution, but Raven's speed advantage is so big that it doesn't really matter that much. Now, don't get me wrong, both of them are good units. So yeah, I think Raven is absolutely fantastic as a unit. His only weakness besides the sword lock before promotion is like low res and low con, which are problem, or like not low con, it's not a weakness. Low res and low luck. He can face crit sometimes, but in FE7 you have the tactician bonus, which no matter what affinity you are, you get some crit avoid out of it depending on the number of tactician stars, and that will usually get him out of crit range from most regular enemies. Like, even though his base luck is pretty low, it takes something like a thunder mage to actually have crit on Raven. Everything else he's pretty fine against. And a low res is something like all physical units have, and he's still better against mages than most of your cast, because he doubles them and he counters them with hand axes, so that's not a real problem with him, I find. So I think he's pretty good. He does have one more problem, and that's like lack of a mount. That is an issue in FE7, I will not deny that one. But in the context of this tier list, I think he still compares favorably to all these units. I think I'm going to put him like around here. I think Deke is like, he has a better niche in the early game where a few units are good. But I think Raven stands out enough compared to other units that I'm comfortable putting him above. Next on the list is Garrick from the Sacred Stones. Garrick joins a bit later than most of these others, especially in Ephraim route. Eric Rowley joins chapter 10, and Ephraim Rowley joins like chapter 13. And Erica Rout, he joins like, you could say he joins like the end of the chapter basically, depending on how you play it, because he doesn't join right away. You gotta like make it to him, and you know, I generally just beat the chapter without recruiting him. So for me, he usually joins like chapter 11 instead. And but that doesn't mean he's bad. Garrick is like a gateway drug to early promoting, I find, because they made him exactly level 10 and they always gave him a hero crest. So he's basically saying, promote me now, just do it. And it's a good idea. It really makes him very good at fighting. I think in Erica Rout in particular, after you recruit him, there's like 2 route maps coming up where there's like a pretty big demand for 1-2 range. So if you promote Garrick right away to a hero, give him hand axes, he becomes like super good in those maps. It's super nice to have him promoted and kill all these monsters with a hand axe or what have you. It doesn't double quite everything because his speed, it's good enough for most slower types of enemies, but it doesn't double most gargoyles, I think. For example, he's not going to double those mouth dogs, but generally he's fast enough for like the slower types of enemies. And that's good enough to be like contributing to a route. And for route, I think he's a bit worse because he's like a lot less livability, but he still joins the middle of a route map where he has like a lot of work that he can get done. He's very, very good in that. I find like he's a bit of a filler that late in the game because it like depends on how you train your units. Like if you have room in your deployment slots, then Garrick can be pretty good. But for example, in my latest Iron Man FE8, I didn't really use Garrick because pretty much all of my good units were still alive except Mulder, so he couldn't really replace Mulder, and for that reason I didn't really have deployment slot for him. Like also using like a ton of other units, but I know I've had playthroughs where I've used Garrick and I know how good he is. I think he's pretty damn good. It's just I think his lack of availability makes him a bit worse than these other mercenaries, but I think all the GBA mercenaries belong like pretty much together when it comes to like how statistically strong they are. He's really, really strong at fighting things. He has the alternative promotion of going Ranger instead of Hero. I just kind of assume Hero because I think it's his best promotion. I think Garrick's promotion tree is the most balanced one in all of FE8. With the exception of like maybe Assassin versus Rogue, because both of those are trash and it doesn't really matter what you make home. But Garrick, he actually has some drawbacks to both of his classes, which I really like. Most promotion trees I find are pretty much whatever. Like there's always like a superior option in almost every regard. Like I feel like Wyvern Knight is almost always better than both the alternatives that exist for it, for both Pegasus and Cormag. Like I think Paladin is a lot better than Great Knight for pretty much every character that can become Eater. Great Knight is a lot better than General, no matter what you guys say about Amelia. But when it comes to Ranger versus Hero, it's like, do you want a mount or do you want 1-2 range? Both of those are so good. Now, when Garrick becomes a Ranger, he only has 7 move, whereas most mounted classes should have 8 move in GBA, like the Paladin class. So it's not that big of a difference, but it can make a difference. He still gets bows, but bows are pretty trash for him. Like I feel like within the GBA games, especially FE7, FE8, you want to have 1-2 range. If you don't have 1-2 range when using a weapon, what are you doing, right? There's so many 1-2 range enemies. You want to be able to counter both 1 range and 2 range enemies. But the mount is really nice. And as a mount, he can like rescue other people, and people also have an easier time rescuing him because he gains less constitution, which is ironically useful. For the same reason as for Deke, because but if he promotes into hero, it's actually so heavy that a lot of people can't rescue him anymore, which makes it harder to keep up with people like Seth and Franz and Vanessa and Cormac and all those other good mounted units. So that's actually a legit drawback that Garrick has when he becomes a hero. But I think the 1-2 range hand axes are worth it. If you don't promote Garrick instantly, I think he's a lot worse overall. He does have like reasonable growth, not excellent, but good enough that he gets some out of them. It's just the utility he gets out of promoting. It's just so nice, and the game is just like tempting you into it, and it's just a really good idea in general. I don't think you should leave Garrick unpromoted, but some people do it, and I can see why. I mean, I get that it can be scary to promote early, but promoting Garrick is just so worth. Next is Gregor. I don't know if he properly fits the title of a mercenary, but he kind of behaves like one, and I think he mentions a payroll at some point, so I just put him in there. Also because there's just not that many characters I could put in here. Like, I put Shuta from Last Promise. You know I'm desperate for extra units if I'm putting a Last Promise character in here, but for an archetype that's been around since FE1, they kind of stopped doing them at some point. I don't know why there's so few of these, but at least let me go in depth on some of these. I can't really go in depth on Gregor though, because I just don't know enough about him. All I know about him, I think I used him like once in a Awakening playthrough that was in like normal or hard mode or something. I saw Mangs use him in Iron Man until he died. Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about Gregor. I think he has that skill that has a random chance to give you gold, and that can be pretty nice, I guess. but it doesn't really do a whole lot, I think. Relying on random chance is never really a good idea. I remember his stats being okay for hard mode. He's like able to double and kill things. I don't think he really keeps up very well when you go into Falm. Yeah, I don't think he's really suited for fighting the enemies that you fight there. He doesn't seem to have the effective weaponry that you need to succeed in that place. And I think Awakening in general is just, it comes down to a Robin fast so hard whenever I see it being played that I really can't give you an accurate description of how good he is. But I looked around on some tier lists on the internet and they usually end up putting him like around the middle, like C or B tier. So I'm gonna put him like around here. I found his stats to be like decent but not super great. So I'm not sure exactly where you would put him. Maybe he's better here or maybe even here. I don't know for sure. For balance reasons of the tier list, like if I wanted to make him a more flatline thing, I'd have to put him here. But from what I can tell, he's not bad enough to be put in C tier, but I really don't know for sure. So help me out on this one. I hope you can help me out in this one, because I have no idea. Speaking of I have no idea, I could theoretically put, say, Selena on here from Fates, or even Laszlo, but I think both of those are retainers, and I think retainers are very different things from mercenaries. So, like, I could put them in here, but I also don't really know enough about them. Like, I use Laszlo as like a rally bot, and that's really all I know about them. So I decided to leave them out and stick to like the people that I think I can reasonably argue to be Ogmas. You know, strong, beefy guys that join reasonably early, or maybe not very early, but I feel like these all have more in common together than the retainers. I'm sure you understand. But don't worry, every unit is going to be tiered eventually. Last but not least, we have Shuda from The Last Promise. So Shuda is a bit of a Myrmidon disguised as a mercenary, so should have picked a better class. I'm very proud of this one, please laugh. Last Promise is a fan hack, in case you don't know, but it's probably the most famous fan hack of them all. It's basically FE7 re-edited with like whole different maps and characters and story. It's absolutely brilliant if you're looking for like a non-serious story to play. It has a lot of memes attached to it, and Shuda is one of the earliest characters to join, so a lot of people should be familiar with them, even if they didn't finish the game. The enemies are pretty weak in The Last Promise early on. They start getting strong later on, but generally Shuda is able to hold his own, I should say. I'm pretty sure it's a guy, but the name is pretty feminine. Shuda is actually a real user on Serenus Force, and I think I've seen him comment on my videos once or twice, so it's kind of awkward talking about them like this. But yeah, Shuda is pretty alright. I've used him like a couple times. I played The Last Promise on stream a pretty long time ago, and I said to myself repeatedly, I'm not going to use Shuda, but they just kept getting good level ups, and I kept having a slot for him, so I kept using him anyway, and he turned out to be pretty good as usual, even though I really wanted to use different characters instead. But hey, it turns out Shuda is just the unit for me apparently. But it kind of works. Like, he's very different from these units because he doesn't really join like stronger than your other units per se. He's just kind of on par with your other characters. But generally his bulk, speed, and strength are pretty much good. And for the same reasons as like an FE7, being able to promote into a class that can use hand axes is just always really good. So, and like if XP gain in The Last Promise is forced to be very good because the game is always played on the equivalent of Limb mode and Edward normal mode. So there's like, you gain XP pretty fast throughout the whole game, and that makes Shuda pretty good. I know exactly where I put him. Like maybe here somewhere. It sounded like I was placing him a lot, but one big drawback for Shuda that I think also holds true for example, Holden, is the abundance of good mounted units in that game. Like, that game has so many good mounted units. You get like 2 early Wyvern Riders in the main game, and then like 2 really good Pegasus Knights, and like a really good Falcon Knight later on, and then you also get like a ton of good Cavaliers. 2 of your Lords are mounted. There is way too many good mounted units in that game, and Shuda has a hard time keeping up with them. He can be rescue dropped to be put in range, but there's other units that you gotta do that for too. Like Sia, for example. God, Sia's so good. But yeah, I think Shuda is like nice, but Last Promise is like a lot of characters that are really good, and I don't think they stand out enough to where I put him up here. But I could be convinced to put him up to B tier. I just felt like the C tier people were kind of alone, so they need some company. Yeah, that's what I think. So, a bit shorter than usual. Not a short video by any means. Like, it's like 48 minutes long, maybe a little bit less once I edit out like the silent bits where I got interrupted. But hopefully you enjoyed this tier list. Let me know where you disagree. I know Gregor might not be in the right place because I don't really know enough about them. I know I might have fucked up on another FE3 unit once or twice because, you know, I don't really know as much about those games as I usually do. But I'm pretty happy with everything else mostly. So thank you for watching. Let me know what else you want me to tier, and I will see you guys again real soon. Peace and goodbye.